The camera battery dies in complete darkness. For 3 seconds, you see nothing. Then you hear it. The metal scrape of a baton dragging across concrete. The wet rhythm of breathing too close to your hiding spot. The bass rumble of footsteps that belong to something far too large to be moving that quietly. Your hands are shaking on the controller because you know what comes next. You have no weapon. You have no way to fight back. The only thing between you and whatever is hunting you through Mount Massive Asylum is a locker door, and the hope that you can hold your breath long enough for it to pass. This is Outlast, and if you've played it, you already know that hope is a luxury you can't afford for long. Red Barrels released Outlast in 2013, and it did something that most horror games talk about, but rarely commit to. It stripped you of every tool you use to feel powerful. No guns, no knives, no convenient pipe lying around for you to swing at the things that want you dead. Just a camera with night vision that drains batteries faster than you can find them. And the knowledge that when something catches you, the best you can hope for is that it kills you quickly. The game sold millions of copies. It spawned sequels and DLC, and a dedicated fan base that treats it like scripture. But here's what nobody talks about when they discuss why Outlast works. The game succeeds because it refuses to lie to you about what survival actually looks like when you have no power and the systems that promised to protect you have become the threat. Over the next few hours, we're going to break down every element that makes Outlast hit differently than other horror games. We'll examine the camera mechanic and what it means to document horror you can't stop. We'll explore Mount Massive Asylum as a monument to institutional betrayal, where the building itself tells you that help has always been harm. We'll diagnose the variants as what they actually are, victims who became threats because someone weaponized their suffering for profit. And we'll talk about why the battery mechanic everyone hates is actually the most honest game design choice Red Barrels ever made. By the end, you'll understand why Outlast has staying power that most horror games will never achieve, and why that power comes from validating experiences that other games prefer to ignore. If you find something in this deep dive that resonated with you, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know what part hit hardest for you, whether it was a specific mechanic, a character analysis, or just a moment that connected with something you've experienced. And while you're down there, throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. Some of the best scripts I've written came directly from you guys pointing me toward games I'd overlooked or angles I hadn't considered. Building this community means actually talking to each other in the comments, and that's genuinely my favorite part of making these videos. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's start. The idea you need to hold on to through everything that follows is simple. Outlast works because it understands that powerlessness is a real psychological state, and pretending you can shoot your way out of that state is the lie that breaks immersion for anyone who knows better. Chapter 1. When Helplessness Becomes Horror. Most horror games give you a weapon and then spend the rest of their runtime making you feel like it's not enough. The ammunition is scarce, the enemies are tough, the boss fights require pattern memorization and skill. This creates a specific type of fear, the fear that you'll fail mechanically, that your reflexes or your resource management or your strategic thinking won't be sufficient to overcome the challenge. It's legitimate fear, but it's fundamentally about competence testing. The game is asking whether you're good enough to win. Outlast asks a different question. It asks what you do when winning was never an option. Miles Upshur arrives at Mount Massive Asylum on the night of September 17, 2013, following an anonymous tip about illegal experiments. He's a freelance investigative journalist, which means he has exactly two tools at his disposal: a camera and the ability to ask uncomfortable questions. He doesn't carry a gun because journalists generally don't. He doesn't have combat training because his job involves research and writing, not physical confrontation. When he climbs through that window into the asylum's upper floor and discovers that every staff member is either dead or gone, and the patients have taken over the facility, Miles doesn't suddenly transform into an action hero. He stays exactly what he is, a man with a camera who is catastrophically unprepared for what he's walked into. This creates the foundational horror of Outlast. You are mechanically incapable of fighting the things that hunt you. Chris Walker can rip your head off with his bare hands. Eddie Gluskin can overpower you in seconds. Even the standard variants, the failed test subjects wandering the corridors in various states of psychosis, are stronger and faster than Miles. Your character's lack of combat ability is realistic, but realism in this context means accepting that when something corners you, your options narrow to hiding or running, and both options can fail. The game reinforces this helplessness through every system it designs. The stamina meter means you can only run for limited stretches before Miles starts wheezing and slowing down. The lack of a mini-map means you're constantly disoriented in the asylum's identical corridors. The hiding spots are obvious: lockers, beds, barrels, which means enemies can check them, and sometimes do. There's no skill tree to unlock that gives you combat moves. From the first moment to the last, you are prey. The game never pretends otherwise. This design philosophy immediately splits the audience. Players who come to horror games expecting power progression feel frustrated. They interpret the helplessness as bad design, as the developers being too lazy to implement combat systems or too pretentious to give players agency. These players bounce off Outlast hard. They don't finish it. They leave reviews calling it a walking simulator with occasional chase sequences. But for another type of player, this helplessness is exactly what makes Outlast work. These are people who understand viscerally what it feels like to be in situations where fighting back would get you killed, where your only survival strategy is to be invisible, or compliant, or lucky. They recognize the specific terror of being hunted by something you can't overpower. When they play Outlast and feel frustrated by their inability to fight Chris Walker, that frustration is the point. The game is simulating a real psychological experience, the crushing weight of knowing that strength won't save you, that skill won't matter, that your survival depends entirely on factors outside your control. Horror works differently depending on what you bring to it. If your relationship with fear is primarily about conquering challenges, then horror games that withhold the tools for conquest feel broken. But if your relationship with fear includes experiences where conquest was never possible, where the horror came from being utterly powerless in the face of something overwhelming, then Outlast's refusal to arm you becomes validation rather than frustration. The game is saying that your fear was appropriate, that surviving without fighting back is legitimate survival, that powerlessness is a real state that deserves to be represented honestly rather than papered over with power fantasy. This matters because most media consistently lies about power dynamics. Action movies give the underdog a moment where they turn the tables. Revenge narratives provide cathartic violence against oppressors. Even horror games that start with helplessness usually give you weapons eventually. Resident Evil 7 begins with Ethan defenseless, but gradually arms him with increasingly powerful guns, until he's mowing down molded creatures with a grenade launcher. These narratives serve psychological purposes. They suggest that agency can be reclaimed, that power imbalances can be overcome, that fighting back is always an option if you're brave or smart or determined enough. Outlast refuses that comfort. Miles never becomes powerful. He never turns the tables. The closest he comes to agency is choosing which direction to run and where to hide, and even those choices are often forced by the environment or the enemy's positions. The game's message is uncomfortable. Sometimes you're just trying to survive, and survival is its own achievement even when it doesn't include triumph. This connects to broader conversations about media representation of trauma. Survivors of situations where they couldn't fight back, abuse victims, people trapped in institutional systems, anyone who's experienced overwhelming force from authority, often feel alienated by media that insists fighting back is always possible. Those narratives implicitly suggest that if you didn't fight back, you chose passivity. They frame survival without resistance as a moral failure rather than a realistic response to impossible circumstances. Outlast rejects that framework entirely. The game presents situations where fighting back would be suicide, and it never judges Miles for choosing survival over heroism. It validates the fundamental legitimacy of retreat, hiding, and outlasting as survival strategies when direct confrontation is impossible. The variants themselves reinforce this dynamic. They're not zombies or demons or mindless monsters. They're people, psychiatric patients who were experimented on by the Murkoff Corporation until their minds shattered. The documents scattered throughout Mount Massive reveal their backstories. Chris Walker was a military police officer with PTSD who came to the asylum seeking treatment and was instead subjected to the morphogenic engine. Eddie Gluskin survived childhood sexual abuse only to have his already damaged psyche destroyed, further by Murkoff's experiments. Father Martin developed messianic delusions that the engine amplified into full psychotic breaks. These people were victims before they became threats. Understanding this creates an additional layer of horror. You're not fighting evil. You're running from people who've been so thoroughly destroyed by institutional abuse that they can't distinguish between self-defense and murder, between help and harm. Killing them, if Miles could kill them, wouldn't be righteous violence against monsters. It would be putting down victims of a system that should have protected them. The fact that Miles can't kill them removes that moral complexity by making it impossible. But the game wants you to feel the weight of what that combat would have meant. This gets at why Outlast hits differently than games with similar mechanics. Amnesia: The Dark Descent also strips you of weapons and forces you to hide from monsters, but Amnesia's monsters are explicitly supernatural. They're beings summoned through dark rituals, removed from humanity. You can feel clean fear toward them without the complication of recognizing their humanity. Outlast puts you in an asylum full of former people, and every chase sequence carries the knowledge that the thing hunting you used to be someone who needed help and received torture instead. The game's perspective, first person, through Miles's eyes, makes this helplessness intimate. You don't watch Miles run from a detached camera angle. You are Miles, breathing hard, vision bouncing as you sprint through corridors, unable to see what's behind you without turning around and losing precious speed. The camera work is intentionally nauseating during chase sequences. The screen tilts and sways, the edges blur, everything becomes motion and panic. This isn't polished cinematography. It's the visual language of actual fear, where perception narrows and fine motor control degrades and you can't process details because your brain is screaming that you need to move. Red Barrels understood that horror games fail when they let players feel competent during moments that should be overwhelming. Outlast succeeds because it denies you that competence. You will run into walls during chases. You will fumble with doors while something closes in behind you. You will dive into a locker and immediately wonder if you should have kept running instead. These aren't failures of game design. They're accurate simulations of what panic does to decision-making and motor skills. The game makes you feel incompetent, because that's what genuine fear does to people. This creates an unusual relationship between player and character. In most games, you feel more capable than your character, because you're the one making strategic decisions while they execute them. In Outlast, you often feel less capable than Miles because his panic is your panic, and the game's design ensures that your decision-making degrades under pressure, just like real human decision-making does. You'll make bad calls, you'll choose wrong, and you'll survive despite those mistakes only because the game's checkpoint system is surprisingly generous. A mercy that prevents the helplessness from becoming actual game-ending frustration. That generosity with checkpoints reveals something important about Outlast's design philosophy. The game wants you to feel helpless, but it doesn't want you to stop playing. Death is frequent, but it never sends you back more than a few minutes. This creates a rhythm where you experience overwhelming fear. Die to it, respawn close enough that you don't lose significant progress, and try again with slightly more knowledge of the threat's patterns. The fear remains intense because the encounters themselves are terrifying, but the punishment for failure is mild enough that you keep pushing forward. This distinguishes Outlast from punishing horror games like Alien, Isolation, where death can send you back 15 or 20 minutes and force you to replay long stretches. Isolation's punishment system creates different psychological pressure. The fear of losing progress compounds the fear of the alien itself. Outlast chooses accessibility over punishment. The game's horror comes from the encounters themselves, and it trusts those encounters to be frightening enough without needing to add severe mechanical consequences for failure. The result is a game that's terrifying but completable. The helplessness never becomes so oppressive that it kills forward momentum. Instead, it becomes a state you gradually accept. You will be powerless. You will be hunted, and your job is simply to survive until the next checkpoint. This acceptance mirrors how people survive real powerlessness. You stop fighting against the fundamental unfairness of your situation and start focusing on incremental survival. The next hiding spot, the next corridor, the next moment of safety, however temporary. But helplessness is only the foundation of Outlast's horror. The game builds something more specific on that foundation. A horror about documentation and witness that transforms your camera from a tool into a burden you can't put down even when you desperately want to. Chapter 2: The Camera That Won't Let You Look Away. Miles Upshur is a journalist. Not a soldier, not a cop, not an action hero moonlighting in investigation. A journalist. His profession defines everything about how Outlast functions, mechanically and thematically. He came to Mount Massive to document what's happening inside the asylum, to gather evidence, to eventually publish a story that will expose Murkoff's crimes. The camera he carries serves that purpose. It's his tool for bearing witness to atrocity. But witness has a cost, and Outlast makes you pay it. The camera mechanic operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Functionally, it provides night vision that allows you to navigate the asylum's darkened areas. The green-tinted night vision mode is Outlast's most iconic visual element, that grainy, phosphorescent view of corridors and cells that turns human faces into skull-like masks. Most of the asylum has no power, or has had its lights deliberately shut off, and navigating in pure darkness is impossible. The night vision makes exploration possible, but it drains batteries at a steady rate, creating constant pressure to find more batteries or risk being trapped in darkness when you need vision most. This creates the foundation of Outlast's resource management. You don't manage ammunition or healing items, you manage the ability to see. Batteries are scattered throughout the environment, on shelves, in drawers, on bodies. You'll find yourself compulsively checking every corner and container, not because you might find a weapon upgrade or a key item, but because you need those batteries like oxygen. The camera becomes a life support system that's constantly threatening to fail, but the camera functions as more than just a tool. It's a metaphor for the burden of witness. Miles documents everything. When you approach certain scenes, a mutilated corpse, a disturbing experiment setup, evidence of Murkoff's crimes, the camera automatically focuses and records, and Miles's notebook generates an entry. These entries are written from Miles's perspective, documenting what he's seeing and his reactions to it. They're not clinical descriptions. They're the thoughts of someone being forced to witness horror that no training prepared him for. When he finds a room full of bodies stacked like cordwood, his note reflects genuine psychological distress. When he discovers the extent of the experiments, his writing becomes more fragmented, more urgent, more disturbed. The game mechanically rewards you for recording these moments. Finding all the document recordings unlocks achievements and fills out the complete story. But there's a psychological cost that the game doesn't directly name. To get that documentation, you have to stop and look. You have to point your camera at the worst things in the asylum and hold it there long enough for Miles to process what he's seeing. You can't look away. The documentation requires sustained attention to atrocity. This mirrors the experience of real journalists and documentarians who cover traumatic events. They carry cameras into war zones, disaster sites, places where humans have suffered immensely, and their job requires them to document that suffering in detail, to not turn away even when every instinct screams to stop looking. That sustained witness creates secondary trauma, the psychological damage that comes from repeated exposure to others' suffering. Miles experiences that secondary trauma in real time, and the game makes you complicit in it by rewarding you for seeking out the worst scenes to document. The camera also creates a specific type of vulnerability. While you're using night vision, you still feel exposed to enemies. Even if the night vision itself doesn't literally emit visible light in universe, you're forced to rely on it so heavily that any moment without it feels like courting death. This means the tool you need to navigate safely also marks you as a target. The game forces you to constantly balance the need to see against the risk of being seen. Do you keep night vision on while moving through an area where you know Chris Walker is hunting? Or do you turn it off and navigate by sound and the faint ambient light, preserving your concealment but risking walking directly into danger you couldn't see? These decisions happen dozens of times per hour of gameplay. They create a constant low-grade stress that compounds the acute terror of chase sequences. Even in moments of relative safety, you're managing battery levels, scanning for the next battery pickup, deciding whether to use night vision or risk moving in darkness. The camera that should make you feel safer instead becomes another source of anxiety. This design choice is brilliant because it transforms a tool into a burden. In most games, acquiring tools feels empowering. Finding a shotgun in Resident Evil or a new gadget in a Batman game makes you feel more capable, more ready to handle threats. Finding a battery in Outlast just means you've temporarily forestalled the moment when your camera dies and you're left blind. The relief of finding batteries is always temporary. The anxiety about running out is permanent. The camera's night vision also affects how you perceive the asylum itself. The green-tinted view flattens depth, perception, and makes spatial relationships harder to judge. Corridors that might not be particularly unsettling in normal light become deeply unnerving when viewed through night vision. Human faces lose their subtlety and become collections of shadows and highlights, threatening even when the person is harmless. The visual filter transforms Mount Massive from a building into a nightmare space, where familiar architectural elements, doors, hallways, windows, become unreliable and threatening. Red Barrels understood that changing how you see changes what you see. The night vision is necessary for practical navigation, but it also alters your psychological relationship with the environment. You're not seeing the asylum as it is. You're seeing it through a lens that makes everything look like a horror movie, and that framing becomes your reality for most of the game. The camera doesn't just help you document horror, it creates the visual language through which you experience horror. But the most important function of the camera is its role in establishing Miles's purpose at Mount Massive. He's not there to survive. He's there to expose. The entire reason he climbed through that window was to gather evidence that Murkoff Corporation is conducting illegal human experimentation. Everything that happens after, the chases, the hiding, the mounting terror, is secondary to that documentation mission. Miles could theoretically abandon the camera and focus solely on escape, but he doesn't. He keeps recording, he keeps taking notes. Even as the situation deteriorates from illegal experiments to complete massacre, he maintains his role as witness. This dedication to documentation, despite overwhelming personal danger, is the heart of journalism. Real journalists have died getting stories. They've been imprisoned, tortured, and killed by the powers they were exposing. They do it anyway because the exposure matters more than personal safety. Miles embodies that commitment, and the game never frames it as heroic or foolish. It just is. He's a journalist, so he documents. That's the job. The tragedy of Miles's story is that his documentation ultimately fails to save him. He gathers the evidence, he records the experiments, he witnesses the Walrider and understands what Murkoff created, but he never gets to publish it. By the game's end, Miles is possessed by the Walrider after he terminates Billy Hope's life support, and while his body walks out of Mount Massive, Miles himself is functionally dead, his consciousness subsumed by the nanite swarm that now controls his flesh. The camera footage presumably survives, but Miles doesn't live to see his story published. This creates a deeply uncomfortable lesson about the cost of bearing witness. Sometimes documentation isn't enough. Sometimes you gather all the evidence, you do everything right, and you still become another casualty of the system you were trying to expose. Waylon, the whistleblower from the DLC whose anonymous email brought Miles to Mount Massive, actually escapes and gets his footage published. But Miles's fate suggests that witness alone doesn't guarantee survival or justice. The person doing the witnessing might be consumed by what they're documenting. This connects to broader themes about the relationship between documentation and change. We live in an era of unprecedented documentation. Atrocities that once happened in darkness now happen on camera. Police violence, war crimes, human rights abuses, all captured on phones and uploaded instantly. And yet, documentation alone rarely produces the accountability it promises. The footage exists, the evidence is clear, and the systems that enabled the abuse continue operating. Outlast understands this gap between witness and consequence. Miles documents everything, and it doesn't save him. The evidence exists, and Murkoff continues. The Whistleblower DLC complicates this further by showing Waylon's perspective. He's a Murkoff employee, a software engineer who maintained the morphogenic engine. He witnessed what the engine did to patients, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain complicit. So he sent an anonymous email to Miles hoping external exposure would shut the operation down. Then he was caught, subjected to the engine himself, and forced to survive the same nightmare Miles walks into. The difference is that Waylon has something Miles doesn't, a family waiting for him. His wife and children are his motivation to survive, and that motivation carries him through horrors that Miles experiences as a solitary witness. Waylon escapes. He gets out of Mount Massive with his footage intact. The implication is that his evidence reaches the public and creates at least some consequences for Murkoff. But the game's broader universe, explored in Outlast 2 and the comics, makes clear that exposure didn't stop Murkoff. The corporation adapted, moved. Operations continued pursuing the morphogenic engine project under different names. Waylon's documentation mattered, but it wasn't a fatal blow to institutional evil. It was just one journalist's attempt to hold power accountable, an attempt that succeeded in exposure but failed to dismantle the underlying systems. The camera in Outlast represents both the possibility and the limitation of documentation as resistance. Miles and Waylon both carry cameras into Mount Massive. They both document atrocities. One dies possessed by the thing he was documenting. The other escapes to testify, and the institution they exposed continues operating because documentation without enforcement is just information, and information alone rarely defeats power that doesn't fear consequences. This might sound cynical, but it's actually realistic. Real journalists expose crimes constantly, and many of those crimes continue because the exposure doesn't translate into meaningful accountability. The camera can witness, it can record, it can create an undeniable record that atrocity occurred, but it can't force institutions to care about that record or face consequences for what it reveals. That transformation requires structures of accountability that often don't exist or don't function. Outlast makes you feel this limitation through gameplay. You document everything, you gather all the evidence, and none of it helps you during the moment-to-moment survival. The camera doesn't give you power over your environment. It just gives you the ability to record your powerlessness. The night vision lets you see the things hunting you, but seeing them doesn't make them less dangerous. Knowledge without power is just heightened awareness of your vulnerability. This creates a specific type of horror that goes beyond jump scares or gore. It's the horror of knowing that the evidence you're gathering might not matter, that the institutions you're trying to expose might be too entrenched to be dismantled by mere documentation, that your witness, however complete, however honest, might change nothing at all. You keep documenting anyway because that's what journalists do, but the game never promises that your documentation will achieve justice. It only promises that the record will exist. The battery mechanic intensifies this burden. Your ability to document depends on finding enough batteries to keep the camera functional. In darker sections of the asylum, you might be forced to choose between using night vision to navigate safely or conserving batteries for later when you'll need them more desperately. These choices make documentation feel costly in immediate, tangible ways. Every minute of night vision is a resource expenditure. Every recorded scene is time spent vulnerable while you hold the camera steady. The act of witness requires sacrifice of safety, of resources, of forward momentum. This is why players who love Outlast often defend the battery mechanic, despite its unpopularity. The mechanic isn't just artificial difficulty or resource management for its own sake. It's a system that makes witness feel like the burden it actually is. If batteries were infinite, if night vision had no cost, then documentation would feel trivial. Just a button you press to unlock achievements. The scarcity creates stakes. The anxiety about battery levels mirrors the real anxiety of journalists and documentarians who know their equipment can fail, their footage can be confiscated, their ability to bear witness can be taken from them by circumstances beyond their control. The camera ultimately asks a question that has no comfortable answer. If documentation doesn't stop atrocity, if witness doesn't guarantee justice, then what's the point of carrying that burden? Why keep recording when the recording itself might die with you? Outlast doesn't answer this question with platitudes about truth or justice. It answers by showing that Miles and Waylon keep documenting anyway, not because it will definitely work, but because it's the only tool they have. When you're powerless to stop the horror directly, when you can't fight the people creating the suffering, documentation becomes the only form of resistance available. It might not be enough. It probably won't be enough. But it's what you can do, so you do it. That ethos, doing what you can even when you know it might not be sufficient, is deeply meaningful for people who've tried to expose institutional abuse, who've blown whistles on corrupt systems, who've documented harm and watched the institutions responsible face minimal consequences. Outlast validates that experience. It says that witness matters even when it doesn't stop the horror. That documentation has value even when it doesn't produce justice. That sometimes survival and record-keeping are the only victories available, and those victories count even though they're incomplete. The camera won't save you, but you carry it anyway. You document anyway. You bear witness anyway. Because if you don't, there won't be any record at all. And a record, however inadequate, however posthumous, is better than silence. That burden is what the camera represents, and Outlast makes you feel the weight of it for every minute you play. Chapter 3. Mount Massive, where help became harm. The building itself is a character in Outlast. Mount Massive Asylum isn't just a setting where horror happens. It's a physical manifestation of institutional betrayal, a structure that was designed to heal and instead became an engine for creating suffering. The asylum had been operating since at least the early 1950s as a psychiatric hospital, a place where people with severe mental illness could receive treatment. That original purpose is still visible in the architecture. The administrative wing has offices where doctors once filed patient reports. The wards have rooms where group therapy sessions were conducted. The medical wing contains examination rooms and surgical theaters that were meant for legitimate psychiatric care. Mount Massive was built with the vocabulary of healing: white walls, long corridors with natural light, spaces designed to feel institutional but not overtly threatening. Then it closed. Then Murkoff Corporation acquired it. The documents scattered throughout the game tell this story in fragments. Mount Massive was abandoned in 1971. Murkoff reopened it in 2009, ostensibly to continue its operation as a psychiatric facility but with upgraded research capabilities. The initial changes seemed reasonable: new equipment, updated treatment protocols, increased security to protect both staff and patients. But underneath those surface improvements, Murkoff was transforming the asylum into something entirely different. They built the underground laboratory levels. They installed the morphogenic engine. They began recruiting patients who fit specific psychological profiles, people whose existing trauma and mental illness made them vulnerable to the engine's effects. By the time the game begins in 2013, Mount Massive has been a Murkoff research facility for 4 years. The administrative staff who remained from the hospital era either became complicit in the experiments or were gradually replaced by personnel who understood that Mount Massive's real purpose had nothing to do with psychiatric care. The patients became subjects. The treatment became experimentation. And the building that was supposed to represent society's commitment to helping people with mental illness became proof that institutions claiming to provide care can actually be sites of torture when oversight fails and profit becomes the primary motivation. This inversion of purpose is visible in every section of the asylum. The cells that once housed patients for their own safety now look like prison blocks. The therapy rooms have become interrogation spaces. The medical equipment meant for healing has been repurposed for harm. Red Barrels was meticulous about environmental storytelling. Every room tells you something about how Mount Massive decayed from hospital to laboratory to slaughterhouse. The administrative block where Miles first enters is relatively preserved. The offices still have their desks and filing cabinets. The hallways have motivational posters about mental health and recovery. But blood streaks the walls. Bodies of security personnel are scattered throughout. File cabinets have been ransacked, and documents are strewn across floors, suggesting someone tried to destroy evidence before fleeing. This section establishes that something catastrophic happened recently. The asylum didn't deteriorate slowly over decades, but collapsed suddenly when the wall rider escaped and the patients revolted. Moving deeper into Mount Massive means descending through layers of institutional horror. The male ward is where most of the variants roam freely. These are the patients who survived the engine's effects, but were driven insane by the process. They're not aggressive toward you unless you draw attention. Most of them are too psychologically damaged to care about anything beyond their own fractured realities, but their presence turns the ward into a space of constant low-grade threat. You're walking through corridors full of people who might attack at any moment, and you have no way to defend yourself if they do. The prison block reveals that Mount Massive wasn't just experimenting on voluntary patients. The facility had arrangements with the criminal justice system to accept certain inmates, people who were given the choice between serving full sentences or participating in psychiatric rehabilitation that would lead to early release. these people were told they'd receive treatment. What they actually received was the morphogenic engine. The cells in this section are smaller, more brutal, with restraints still attached to walls and floors. This was where Murkoff kept subjects who resisted or who became too dangerous even by the asylum's standards. The underground laboratory is where the architectural language shifts entirely. The upper levels of Mount Massive at least pretend to be a psychiatric facility. The lab makes no such pretense. It's pure research infrastructure. Monitoring stations, containment cells, the massive morphogenic engine taking up an entire chamber like some biomechanical god. The lab is where you understand the full scope of what Murkoff was doing. The engine was designed by Rudolf Wernicke, a Nazi scientist who continued his experimentation after World War II under American protection. The game directly parallels Operation Paperclip, where the United States government granted immunity to Nazi scientists in exchange for their research. Wernicke's engine operates by inducing lucid dreaming states in comatose patients while exposing them to specific imagery designed to manipulate their unconscious minds. The process creates nanomachines, microscopic robots that respond to thought patterns. In most subjects, this just destroys their sanity, but in rare cases, in patients with specific psychological profiles, who can maintain lucid consciousness even while comatose, the nanomachines achieve something approaching sentience and form swarms that can act independently while still being controlled by the host's consciousness. Billy Hope was that rare case. He became the host for the Wall Rider, a nanite swarm that appears supernatural in its abilities, but is actually the result of bleeding-edge technology combined with a human consciousness that's been so thoroughly integrated with the swarm that they're functionally a single entity. Billy is kept alive in a vegetative state, suspended in machinery deep in the laboratory, while the Wall Rider uses his consciousness as an anchor point but operates throughout Mount Massive as an autonomous force. The reveal of Billy's chamber is one of the game's most striking environmental moments. You descend into the deepest part of the facility and find this emaciated figure suspended in tubes and wires, more machine than human at this point, kept alive artificially so the Wall Rider can continue existing. His files reveal he was a relatively normal patient before Murkoff's experiments, someone with manageable psychiatric issues who could have lived a functional life with proper treatment. Instead, he became the living battery for a weapon Murkoff spent years developing. His consciousness merged with technology until the boundaries between Billy and Wall Rider dissolved entirely. Every section of Mount Massive tells a story about how institutions betray the people they claim to serve. The asylum was supposed to protect patients. Instead, it subjected them to experiments that destroyed their minds and bodies. The prison system was supposed to rehabilitate inmates. Instead, it funneled them into a facility that would use them as test subjects. The medical staff were supposed to uphold their Hippocratic oath. Instead, they became researchers for whom patient suffering was just data to be recorded and analyzed. This institutional critique is what elevates Outlast above standard asylum horror. Games like Manhunt or The Suffering use asylum settings for atmosphere. The buildings are just creepy locations where scary things happen. Outlast uses Mount Massive to make a specific argument about how care institutions can become sites of atrocity when corporate profit or government secrecy removes accountability. Every document you find reinforces this argument. Memos about budget allocations for the engine project, performance reviews praising staff members for their willingness to push ethical boundaries, incident reports documenting patient deaths that were covered up or explained away as unfortunate complications. The building's geography creates a literal descent into the darkest levels of institutional evil. You start in the administrative areas, the face the asylum shows to the world. You descend through the wards where patients lived. You go deeper into the prison block where the most vulnerable subjects were held. You reach the underground laboratory where the real purpose of Mount Massive is finally revealed. This descent mirrors the experience of discovering that an institution you trusted has been harming people. You start with surface level awareness, dig deeper, and find layers of abuse that go far beyond what you initially suspected. Mount Massive also functions as a tomb. By the time Miles arrives, most of the staff are dead or have fled. The patients have taken over the facility, but they're trapped inside just as surely as they were before the outbreak. No one is coming to help them. The outside world has no idea what happened here. The asylum has become a self-contained horror, where the victims of Murkoff's experiments are now tearing each other apart in the ruins of the place that destroyed them. This creates a specific type of environmental horror. The building as a monument to abandoned suffering. Mount Massive wasn't destroyed by an external force. It collapsed from within when the Walrider escaped, and the systems designed to contain the variants failed. The institution that created all this suffering couldn't even maintain control of what it had made. The building now stands as physical evidence of institutional failure so complete that the only remaining option was abandonment. Walking through Mount Massive's corridors means walking through proof that the systems claiming to protect vulnerable people can actually be their greatest threat. Every cell you pass held someone who came here expecting treatment. Every restraint system you see was used on someone who was told it was for their own good. Every monitor and camera was part of surveillance infrastructure that watched people suffer and recorded it for analysis. The building is saturated with betrayal at every level: architectural, institutional, individual. The asylum's decay also serves a gameplay function. Collapsed sections force you into specific paths. Flooded areas create acoustic environments where you can hear threats moving through water. Darkened corridors necessitate the camera's night vision, but this functional use of environmental degradation also reinforces the thematic point. Mount Massive is falling apart because the institution was rotten from its foundation. The structural collapse mirrors the moral collapse. The building is literally crumbling under the weight of what was done inside it. Red barrels filled Mount Massive with religious imagery that complicates the institutional critique. Father Martin has covered walls with biblical passages and makeshift crucifixes. Phrases about witnessing and revelation appear in blood throughout the facility. This religious layer suggests that some of the patients, Martin specifically, but others as well, are trying to impose meaning on their suffering through spiritual frameworks. The asylum that claimed to provide scientific psychiatric treatment has become a space where traumatized people reach for religious explanations because the scientific ones failed them so completely. The sewers represent the literal underbelly of Mount Massive's operations, the waste and drainage systems that every institution has but prefers to keep hidden. When Chris Walker throws Miles through a window and he falls several stories into the sewers, it's both a practical game transition and a symbolic descent into the hidden infrastructure that makes the asylum function. The sewers are where you find the most graphic evidence of the outbreak's violence. Bodies that were dumped rather than properly handled, evidence of cannibalism, spaces where the variants who couldn't function even in the chaos upstairs have retreated to live in literal filth. Eddie Gluskin's section in the Whistleblower DLC transforms Mount Massive's vocational block into a workshop of horror. This was where patients learned job skills that would help them reintegrate into society after treatment. Eddie has converted it into his personal hunting ground and surgical theater. He's filled the space with mannequin parts and corpses he's mutilated in his search for the perfect bride. The vocational block was supposed to represent hope, the idea that with treatment and support, people could return to normal life. Eddie's presence turns it into a monument to how profoundly Mount Massive failed its patients, taking someone who needed help for childhood trauma and creating a serial killer instead. The building's acoustic design deserves specific mention. Mount Massive is never silent. You constantly hear distant screams, metal scraping, doors slamming, footsteps echoing through corridors you can't see. The asylum is alive with sound, creating a constant sense that threats are nearby, even when you're temporarily safe. This sound design makes the building feel inhabited in ways that purely visual design couldn't achieve. Mount Massive doesn't feel abandoned, despite most of its population being dead or scattered. It feels like a living organism that's been mortally wounded but hasn't finished dying yet. The game uses darkness not just as a gameplay mechanic but as a thematic element. Large sections of Mount Massive have no power, forcing reliance on night vision. But the darkness also represents the hidden nature of what Murkoff was doing. These experiments happened in darkness, institutional darkness where oversight didn't penetrate, moral darkness where normal ethical boundaries were abandoned. Bringing light to those darkened spaces means witnessing horrors that were deliberately kept hidden, and the game makes you do exactly that. You can't avoid the darkness. You have to walk through it, illuminate it with your camera, document what you find, and carry that knowledge forward. Mount Massive ultimately asks what happens when the places built to heal become places that harm. The building embodies that question in its architecture, its geography, its decay. Every corridor is evidence that institutional promises of care can mask institutional practices of abuse. Every locked door is a reminder that places claiming to provide treatment can actually be prisons. Every examination room with restraints still attached is proof that medical authority can be used to torture rather than heal. The asylum doesn't collapse because it was poorly built. It collapses because what was built inside it, the engine, the experiments, the systematic destruction of vulnerable people, eventually exceeded the institution's ability to contain. Mount Massive stands as a warning about what happens when institutions prioritize research over humanity, when corporate profit or government secrecy removes accountability, when the people with the least power become test subjects for the people with the most. That warning is built into every wall, every cell, every corridor of Mount Massive Asylum, and walking through it means walking through proof that the worst horrors are often committed by institutions that claim to be helping the people they're actually destroying. Chapter 4. The Variants, Victims Who Became Threats. Chris Walker announces himself before you see him. The chains draped across his massive frame rattle with each step. His breathing is labored, wet, too loud, the sound of damaged lungs pushing air through a body that shouldn't still be moving. When he finally appears, he's towering, easily 6.5 feet tall, missing his nose and lips from self-mutilation, wearing only a blood-soaked shirt and pants. His arms are thick with muscle, his hands large enough to crush a human skull, which he does repeatedly throughout the game. Miles's head specifically, if you're not fast enough to hide or run. The documents scattered throughout Mount Massive tell Chris Walker's story in pieces. He was a military police officer who served multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. The exact nature of what he experienced during those deployments is partially redacted in the files you find, but the psychological damage was severe enough that he was referred to a facility called Spindletop for PTSD treatment. Whatever happened at Spindletop made him worse. There's a note suggesting that the failed therapy at Spindletop created a killer, which implies the treatment wasn't just ineffective, but actively harmful. Walker came to Mount Massive seeking help for trauma he'd sustained serving his country. Instead, he was subjected to the morphogenic engine. The engine took a man already struggling with PTSD, already dealing with intrusive memories and hypervigilance and moral injury from combat, and amplified all of it until his grasp on reality shattered completely. The self-mutilation, removing his own nose and lips, is documented as resulting from extreme anxiety, suggesting Walker experienced such overwhelming psychological distress that catastrophic self-harm felt like the only response. By the time Miles encounters him, Walker is operating in a permanent combat mindset. He believes he's still on deployment, still executing a mission. His objective is containment. He's trying to maintain security at Mount Massive by eliminating everyone inside, which in his fractured understanding represents preventing a dangerous outbreak. When he catches Miles, he calls him Little Pig and tears him apart with the casual efficiency of someone who's killed many times before, and views it as operational necessity rather than murder. Walker is terrifying because he's not sadistic, he's not torturing people for pleasure. He's executing what he perceives as a legitimate military objective with maximum efficiency. The head collection he maintains isn't a trophy wall built for psychological gratification. It's documentation of confirmed kills, evidence that he's completing his mission successfully. In Walker's mind, he's still a soldier doing his duty. The fact that there is no mission, no legitimate authority giving him orders, no actual threat requiring lethal response, doesn't register. The engine destroyed his ability to distinguish between combat zones and civilian spaces, between enemies and victims. This makes Walker a tragedy as much as a threat. He's a veteran who sought help for combat trauma and was instead experimented on until he became the thing his trauma had primed him to become. A killer who can't turn off the combat responses that kept him alive in war zones. His violence isn't a betrayal of who he was. It's a continuation of what he was trained to do, now operating without the external structure that gave that training purpose and limits. Father Martin presents a completely different type of horror. He's calm, soft-spoken, moving through the chaos of Mount Massive with serene purpose. He's an older man, bald, wearing improvised priest vestments made from asylum materials. He addresses Miles as apostle and my child, speaking in religious language that frames the nightmare unfolding around them as divine revelation rather than catastrophe. Martin isn't trying to kill Miles, he's trying to guide him, to ensure Miles witnesses the birth of what Martin believes is God. That belief centers on the Wall Rider. Martin has encountered Billy Hope's creation and interpreted it as a divine entity rather than a technological horror. His delusion is systematized and complete. He's built an entire theological framework around the Wall Rider, explaining its origins and purpose in religious terms that make sense internally, even though they're disconnected from reality. Martin sees himself as a prophet, preparing the way for this new God, and he's convinced other variants to help him spread his gospel. Martin's documents reveal he entered Mount Massive with existing mental health issues that likely included religious delusions or grandiose thinking. The morphogenic engine encountered those pre-existing delusions and amplified them into a full messianic complex. Martin doesn't just believe the Wall Rider is important. He believes he was specifically chosen to prepare. It's way that Miles was sent to him for the purpose of bearing witness, that everything happening at Mount Massive is part of a divine plan that requires suffering and death before revelation can occur. This makes Martin uniquely dangerous because his violence is motivated by love. He genuinely cares about Miles in his delusional way. He wants Miles to experience what he's experienced, to understand what he understands. When he sedates Miles and prevents his escape, Martin frames it as mercy. He's saving Miles from leaving before the revelation is complete, protecting him from the damnation that would come from rejecting the truth. From Martin's perspective, everything he does is an act of spiritual guidance rather than cruelty. His death is consistent with his delusion. Martin crucifies himself and sets the cross on fire, believing he will be resurrected by the Wall Rider. He experiences no doubt in his final moments. The pain of immolation can't compete with the absolute certainty of his belief. He dies still convinced that his suffering serves a higher purpose, that his sacrifice will be rewarded, that the God he witnessed will remember his faithful service. It's one of the most disturbing deaths in the game, specifically because it's not inflicted by an enemy. It's self-chosen, the ultimate expression of delusion so complete that self-preservation becomes irrelevant. Eddie Gluskin represents horror rooted in trauma and its transmission. The documents about Eddie reveal he suffered prolonged sexual abuse as a child, repeated violations by his father and uncle that destroyed his developing sense of self and sexuality. This created complex PTSD, a condition where prolonged, inescapable trauma fractures identity and makes normal relationships nearly impossible. Eddie entered Mount Massive with this existing damage. The engine took his trauma and amplified it into a psychotic obsession with marriage and traditional gender roles. Eddie calls himself the groom and speaks in the language of courtship even while performing forced gender reassignment surgeries on male victims he's captured. He's searching for the perfect bride, testing each candidate against impossible standards, and killing them when they inevitably fail his requirements. The workshop he's created in the vocational block is filled with corpses in wedding dresses, mannequin parts, and surgical equipment he barely knows how to use. Eddie operates from a deeply distorted understanding of relationships, where love and violence are so thoroughly entangled that he can't separate them. His psychological profile suggests someone whose abuse destroyed his ability to conceptualize healthy intimacy. The only relationship pattern he internalized was violation disguised as care, pain presented as love. His search for a bride represents his attempt to create the normal life his trauma made impossible. But the only template he has for relationships is abusive. So every attempt to build something healthy immediately becomes torture. Eddie is caught in a loop where he desperately wants connection but can only enact violence, where he craves normalcy but can only perform horror. The game presents Eddie as one of the most immediately threatening variants. His section in Whistleblower is relentlessly tense, with him hunting Wayland through the vocational block while speaking in that disturbing mix of gentleness and menace. But underneath the threat, Eddie is suffering. His delusions aren't protecting him from reality. They're trapping him in an endless cycle of seeking something he can never create because his trauma destroyed the psychological structures necessary for building it. Richard Traeger offers perhaps the most purely malevolent variant personality. Unlike Walker, who operates from combat trauma, or Martin, who acts from religious delusion, or Eddie, who's trapped in trauma repetition, Traeger appears to have been a sadist before Mount Massive destroyed whatever remaining restraints he possessed. His documented history shows he was a Murkoff executive, someone in business development who was complicit in the asylum's operations before eventually being subjected to the engine himself. Traeger presents himself with corporate professionalism even while conducting torture. When he captures Miles, he straps him to a wheelchair and wheels him through his domain, like a client getting a facility tour. He speaks in soothing tones about helping and healing, maintaining the veneer of medical authority, while preparing to mutilate Miles with bone shears. The moment where he removes Miles's fingers isn't frenzied violence. It's methodical, almost surgical, performed while Traeger talks about the importance of trust and cooperation. This calculated cruelty distinguishes Traeger from the other variants. He's not operating from delusion or trauma repetition. He understands exactly what he's doing and derives genuine pleasure from it. His repeated insistence that he's helping, that Miles should be grateful, that this is all for Miles's own good, reveals someone who enjoys the psychological dimension of torture as much as the physical. Traeger wants his victims to doubt themselves, to wonder if maybe he really is trying to help, to experience the cognitive dissonance of being harmed by someone claiming benevolence. His corporate background matters because it suggests Traeger didn't need the engine to become a monster. He needed it to remove the social constraints that prevented him from being openly monstrous. As a Murkoff executive, he participated in institutional cruelty that harmed thousands, but did so through paperwork and bureaucratic distance. The engine removed that distance and let him enact directly the sadism he'd previously expressed through corporate channels. The twins, cannibalistic variants who hunt together, represent the total breakdown of humanity into base survival drives. They were former patients whose files suggest they weren't actually twins but unrelated individuals who developed a codependent relationship during their time at Mount Massive. The engine broke them down to such fundamental levels that they reverted to viewing humans as food rather than fellow beings. Their section takes place in the asylum's kitchen and cafeteria areas, spaces that were meant for nourishment and community now transformed into hunting grounds for predation. What makes the twins particularly disturbing is their coordination. They hunt as a team, communicating with each other, working together to corner prey. This suggests some organizational capacity survived the engine's destruction of their higher cognitive functions. They're not mindless animals. They're humans who've been reduced to their most primitive drives but retained just enough cognitive ability to be effective hunters. Billy Hope deserves attention as the variant who never directly threatens you, but whose presence defines the entire game. When you finally find him in the underground laboratory, he's suspended in machinery, emaciated to the point of looking more skeletal than human, kept alive artificially so the Walrider can continue existing. His files reveal he was an unremarkable patient, someone with manageable psychiatric issues who could have lived a normal life with proper treatment. Instead, he became the successful test subject Murkoff had been seeking. His specific neurological profile allowed him to maintain lucid consciousness even while comatose, which made him compatible with the nanite swarm in ways dozens of previous subjects weren't. The engine worked on Billy, not because he was stronger or more resilient, but because his particular brain structure happened to align with what the technology required. This randomness is crucial. Billy didn't do anything to deserve his fate. He wasn't selected for any characteristic he could control. He was just unlucky enough to be the patient whose neurology made him useful. The Walrider that emerges from Billy is simultaneously him and not him. The consciousness controlling the nanite swarm is Billy's, but it's been so thoroughly integrated with the technology and so warped by years of existence in that hybrid state that calling it Billy anymore is questionable. It's something new, a fusion of human consciousness and machine intelligence that operates according to its own logic. When Billy's life support is terminated at the game's end, the Walrider doesn't dissipate. It transfers to Miles, making him the new host, suggesting the entity has enough independence to survive the death of its original anchor point. Every variant represents a specific way that institutional abuse destroys people. Walker shows what happens when combat trauma receives harmful treatment instead of healing. Martin demonstrates how mental illness can be amplified into dangerous delusion. Eddie reveals how childhood trauma creates adults who can only repeat their damage. Traeger embodies how sadistic personalities weaponize institutional authority. The twins represent the reduction of humanity to survival drives. Billy exemplifies how ordinary people become tools for corporate or governmental projects that view human consciousness as raw material to be processed. None of them chose monstrosity. They were systematically created through processes Murkoff designed and implemented. The horror of Outlast isn't that these people exist. It's that they were made deliberately by an institution that viewed their suffering as acceptable cost for developing a biological weapon. The variants aren't evil beings that spawned from darkness. They're victims who've been so profoundly broken that they've become threats to others, trapped in cycles of violence they can't escape because the damage done to them was too severe and too irreversible. This is what separates Outlast from games where you fight monsters. You're not fighting evil. You're running from the casualties of institutional evil, people who were owed care and received torture, who sought help and were experimented on, who trusted systems that betrayed them completely. Every chase sequence is a testament to Murkoff's crimes. Every variant who hunts you is evidence that the real horror happened before the game even started, in the years of experimentation that turned patients into weapons. The game asks you to survive these people while understanding their victims. That's an uncomfortable tension with no resolution. They're dangerous. Miles has to hide from them or die, but they're also suffering. Their violence comes from damage that wasn't their fault. Both realities exist simultaneously, and Outlast refuses to simplify that complexity. The variants are threats you must evade and victims you can't save, monsters who were made rather than born, evidence of institutional atrocity that you're forced to witness but powerless to stop. That tension is where Outlast's deepest horror lives. The real monster isn't Chris Walker or Eddie Gluskin or Father Martin. The real monster is the Murkoff Corporation and everyone who enabled their experiments. But that monster isn't in the asylum with you. It's insulated by corporate structures and legal protections, operating from offices where hands stay clean while the consequences of decisions get exported to facilities like Mount Massive. The people who created the variants will never face them, never be hunted by what they made, never experience the terror they inflicted on hundreds of victims. You experience it instead. You run through corridors, fleeing from people who were destroyed by systems that will never be held accountable. And that might be the most realistic horror Outlast offers. That institutional evil typically doesn't face consequences proportional to the suffering it creates. The executives who approved the engine project didn't end up strapped to it. The shareholders who profited from Murkoff's research didn't become test subjects. The government officials who provided funding and oversight protection didn't have to survive Mount Massive's collapse. The victims did, and when they couldn't survive as victims, they survived as variants. And now they're the face of horror in the game, while the people actually responsible remain safely distant, documented in files you'll collect but never confront directly. That displacement of consequence is the final horror the variants represent, proof that the people who cause the most suffering are rarely the ones who experience the most pain. Chapter 5. The Battery Mechanic. Everyone hates and why it's brilliant. The battery mechanic in Outlast generates more complaints than any other design choice Red Barrel's made. Players find it frustrating, tedious, immersion-breaking. They argue it forces constant backtracking to search for batteries instead of allowing forward momentum. They claim it interrupts the horror by making you focus on resource management instead of atmosphere. Some mods exist specifically to remove battery limitations entirely, suggesting that a significant portion of the player base believes the game would be better without this mechanic. They're wrong, and understanding why they're wrong reveals something crucial about what Outlast is actually doing. The battery mechanic creates scarcity in the one resource you absolutely need, the ability to see in darkness. Most of Mount Massive has no functional lighting. Navigating without night vision is possible in some areas where ambient light from windows or emergency systems provides minimal illumination, but large sections are pitch black. In those areas, attempting to move without night vision means stumbling blindly, colliding with walls, having no warning when threats appear. The night vision makes navigation possible and survival achievable, but it drains batteries at a steady rate, and batteries are limited resources scattered throughout the environment. This creates constant low-grade anxiety. Even in moments of relative safety, you're monitoring the battery indicator in the corner of the screen. You're calculating whether you have enough charge to reach the next area. You're deciding whether to use night vision now or preserve battery for sections will be darker. You're weighing the risk of exploring side areas for additional batteries against the cost of using battery life to do that exploration. Every decision about when to use night vision and when to risk moving in darkness becomes a micro calculus of resource. preservation versus immediate need. This anxiety mirrors the actual experience of operating with insufficient resources in high-stress situations. When you don't have enough of something essential, money, food, safety, time, you develop a specific psychological relationship with that scarcity. You begin rationing. You become hypervigilant about consumption. You experience constant background stress about the resource running out at a critical moment. The battery mechanic doesn't just create gameplay challenge, it creates the emotional state of scarcity, making you feel the stress of operating with insufficient means in a dangerous environment. People who've experienced actual resource scarcity recognize this immediately. If you've been poor enough that you had to choose between necessities, if you've operated in situations where you didn't have enough of something essential and had to make it stretch, then the battery anxiety in Outlast feels familiar. The mechanic is simulating a real psychological state that people who've always had sufficient resources might not recognize, but that people who've experienced scarcity know intimately. This is why removing battery limitations fundamentally changes what Outlast is doing. With infinite batteries, the night vision becomes a free tool that makes navigation safer and easier. You can leave it on constantly, eliminating the darkness entirely. The game becomes visually monotonous, everything rendered in that green phosphorescent glow. But more importantly, it removes the scarcity anxiety that underpins the entire experience. Without that anxiety, Outlast becomes a game about hiding from enemies, which is fine but substantially less psychologically complex than a game about hiding from enemies while managing a resource you never have enough of. The battery locations themselves are part of the environmental storytelling. You find them on desks where staff members kept them accessible for rounds through darkened sections. You find them in supply closets where maintenance crews stored equipment. You find them on the bodies of people who died trying to navigate the darkness. Each battery pickup tells a small story about the asylum's infrastructure. These were necessary tools for the facility to function, scattered throughout because navigating Mount Massive has always required artificial light. Red Barrels was strategic about battery placement. You never find so many that you feel secure in your supply, but you're rarely in danger of running out completely if you're paying attention. The scarcity is carefully calibrated to create constant concern without reaching the point of actual depletion that would make progression impossible. This is sophisticated resource design, creating the feeling of scarcity while ensuring players who engage with exploration have enough to continue. The mechanic also creates meaningful choices during chase sequences. When Chris Walker is hunting you and you're sprinting through darkened corridors, do you turn on night vision to see where you're going and risk draining battery faster? Or do you run in darkness, preserving charge but unable to see obstacles or identify hiding spots until you're right on top of them? These split-second decisions happen repeatedly during every chase, and they have real consequences. Running blind can get you killed by running into dead ends. Using night vision depletes resources you'll need later. There's no optimal solution. Both choices have costs. This creates the type of decision-making that happens under real duress, where every option has drawbacks, and you're choosing between bad outcomes, rather than trying to identify a good one. The battery mechanic forces you to make those calculations while your hands are shaking and adrenaline is flooding your system, simulating how panic degrades decision-making quality. The camera itself becomes heavy. Not mechanically, Miles doesn't move slower while holding it, but psychologically. You're carrying this device that requires constant resource feeding, that marks you as a target when you use its primary function, that demands you stop and document horror when every instinct screams to keep moving. The camera is simultaneously your most important tool, and a burden you'd abandon if the game allowed it. That dual nature, essential and oppressive at once, creates a relationship with your equipment that most games never achieve. Most games make you love your tools. Finding a new weapon or upgrading existing equipment generates satisfaction. Your tools make you more capable. more powerful, more able to overcome challenges. Outlast makes you resent your tool, even while depending on it completely. The camera isn't making you stronger, it's barely keeping you functional. The batteries aren't power-ups, they're stopgaps against inevitable failure. Your equipment in Outlast represents the minimum necessary to survive, and even that minimum requires constant maintenance and resource investment. This transforms how you experience the environment. You're not exploring Mount Massive to find cool secrets or hidden treasures. You're searching for batteries like your life depends on it, because it functionally does. Every room becomes a potential battery source. Every corpse gets checked. Every desk, every locker, every shelf receives scrutiny, because batteries could be anywhere and you need them desperately. The asylum stops being a space you move through and becomes a resource field you harvest while trying not to die. This desperate scavenging mirrors how people survive in hostile institutional environments. You learn where resources are available. You develop routes that maximize access to what you need. You become expert at quickly assessing spaces for their utility rather than their meaning. The battery hunt turns Miles into someone who's adapted to the asylum's environment, who's internalized its geography as a map of survival resources rather than architectural space. The moment your battery dies in complete darkness is pure helplessness. The screen goes black. You can hear threats, but can't see them. Your ability to navigate is reduced to stumbling forward with your hands out, hoping you're moving toward an exit or battery rather than toward danger. These moments are terrifying precisely because the tool you've depended on for hours has failed, and you're suddenly operating without the ability to perceive threats until they're killing you. Red barrels could have made batteries more plentiful. They could have made night vision drain more slowly. They could have designed Mount Massive with more ambient lighting, so night vision was helpful, but not essential. Every one of those choices would have made the game less frustrating and less effective. The frustration is the point. The anxiety about batteries running out is the point. The constant need to search for resources while being hunted is the point. Remove those elements and you remove the psychological pressure that makes Outlast more than just a hide-and-seek game with horror aesthetics. The battery mechanic is red barrels saying that survival on insufficient resources is a valid horror to represent, that operating in darkness with inadequate tools is a real experience worth simulating, that the anxiety of never having enough is itself a form of horror that deserves mechanical representation. Players who've never experienced genuine resource scarcity might find this frustrating and arbitrary. Players who understand what it feels like to operate without enough of something essential recognize the mechanic as honest simulation of that psychological state. This creates a divide in the player base that's worth acknowledging. Some people play horror games for atmospheric immersion and challenge. For them, the battery mechanic is a frustrating distraction from what they came for: creepy environments and tense chases. Other people play horror games for psychological validation of experiences that most media ignores. For them, the battery mechanic is essential to what makes Outlast meaningful: the simulation of surviving on insufficient resources while being hunted. Neither group is wrong about what they want from horror games. They're just seeking different experiences. Outlast commits fully to the second group's needs, and that commitment makes it divisive. Games that try to please everyone end up diluted. Games that commit fully to a specific experience alienate some players while creating something essential for others. Outlast chose the latter path. But here's something most discussions of Outlast miss. The game's mechanical systems are all working together to create a unified psychological experience. The helplessness, the camera burden, the battery anxiety, the hiding mechanics. These aren't separate features, but integrated elements of a system designed to make you feel like someone surviving an impossible situation with inadequate tools and no path to victory. Every complaint about these mechanics is actually evidence they're working as intended. The frustration is the simulation. The stress is the point. If you're still with me, we're approaching the part most retrospectives ignore, the ending and what it actually means for everything we've witnessed. Because Miles doesn't escape. He doesn't publish his story. And understanding why that matters reveals what Outlast is ultimately saying about witness, institutions, and the cost of trying to expose evil. Chapter 6: The Ending, When Witness Becomes Possession. Miles Upshur spends the entire game documenting Murkoff's crimes with his camera. He records the variants, the experiments, the morphogenic engine, the systematic abuse. He witnesses everything. He survives horrors that killed dozens of others. He makes it further into Mount Massive's depths than anyone else who entered that night. He does exactly what a journalist is supposed to do. He investigates, documents, and prepares to expose, and it destroys him. The ending of Outlast is deliberately devastating. After Father Martin's self-immolation, after witnessing the full scope of the Wall Rider and understanding what Billy Hope has become, Miles reaches the underground laboratory where he hopes to find escape routes. Instead, he's captured by Murkoff's security personnel, who've arrived to contain the outbreak. These soldiers find Miles and see him as a witness who needs to be eliminated, someone who knows too much about what happened at Mount Massive to be allowed to leave. They're preparing to execute him when the Wall Rider intervenes. The nanite swarm kills the soldiers protecting Miles. But this protection comes at a cost Miles doesn't understand until it's too late. Dr. Wernicke, the Nazi scientist who designed the morphogenic engine, is also present in the facility. He's been trying to shut down the Wall Rider by having Miles terminate Billy Hope's life support, removing the host that anchors the nanite swarm to reality. Miles does it. Billy dies. But the Wall Rider doesn't dissipate. It needs a host to maintain cohesion, and Miles is right there, conscious, alive, and filled with the specific type of trauma and obsession that makes him compatible. The Wall Rider enters Miles, merging with his consciousness the way it merged with Billy years earlier. Miles's body walks out of Mount Massive, but Miles himself is functionally dead. His consciousness is subsumed by the entity he spent hours documenting. He became the thing he was investigating. This ending rejects every narrative comfort horror games typically provide. Miles doesn't escape to publish his findings. He doesn't defeat Murkoff or rescue survivors or achieve any victory. He bears witness to everything, documents it comprehensively, and then loses the ability to share what he learned because his identity is consumed by the very horror he was trying to expose. The journalist who came to Mount Massive to reveal the truth leaves as a weapon, controlled by the thing he was documenting. The tragedy is that Miles did everything right. He was brave, thorough, careful. He survived when dozens of others died. He maintained his mission focus even as the situation deteriorated, from investigation to survival. He documented evidence that could have brought down Murkoff Corporation and exposed their crimes to the world. And none of it mattered because the institution he was investigating had resources and power that individual courage couldn't overcome. This ending works thematically because it refuses to promise that witness guarantees justice. Miles witnessed. He documented. He fulfilled the journalist's duty to report truth regardless of personal cost. But witness alone doesn't defeat institutional evil. It just means someone saw what happened and tried to tell others. Whether that telling succeeds, whether it produces accountability, whether the evidence gathered ever reaches people who can act on it, all depend on structures beyond the witness's control. The Wall Rider possession also represents how investigating trauma can mean becoming consumed by it. Miles spent hours immersed in the aftermath of Murkoff's experiments, witnessing variants who were destroyed by institutional abuse, documenting suffering that no one should have to see repeatedly. That sustained exposure to horror changed him. You can track it through his notebook entries, which become more disturbed and fragmented as the night progresses. By the time the wall rider takes him, Miles has already been psychologically invaded by what he witnessed. The physical possession just makes literal what was already happening metaphorically. This connects to the real psychological toll of investigative work focused on institutional abuse. Journalists who cover war crimes, humanitarian disasters, systemic injustice, they carry what they witness. The stories don't stay external. They invade your dreams, your thoughts, your sense of safety. You can maintain professional distance for a while, but sustained exposure breaks down those barriers. The horror you're documenting begins documenting itself on you. Miles's possession is the extreme version of that process. The horror he documented consumed him so completely that his identity dissolved into it. The Whistleblower DLC complicates this ending by showing Waylon Park's successful escape. Waylon makes it out of Mount Massive with his footage intact. He uploads it to journalists. The implication is that his evidence creates at least temporary consequences for Murkoff. But the game's expanded universe reveals that exposure didn't stop the corporation. They adapted, moved operations, continued their work under different structures. Waylon's witness mattered, but it wasn't sufficient to dismantle the system he exposed. This creates a dual ending for Outlast's narrative. Miles's ending is tragic. Witness that consumed the witness without producing justice. Waylon's ending is bittersweet. Witness that survived long enough to be shared, but didn't prevent further atrocity. Together they present a realistic portrait of what individual courage achieves against institutional evil. Sometimes you get consumed by what you're investigating. Sometimes you escape to testify. But in both cases, the institution usually survives because individual witness rarely has the power to destroy structures that operate at organizational and governmental levels. The final image of the game is Miles's body walking toward Murkoff's soldiers, the wall rider controlling his movements, about to kill them. The camera is still recording. It's been running this entire time, capturing everything including Miles's possession. The footage exists. The evidence exists. Someone could theoretically recover that camera and see exactly what happened. But Miles will never publish it. The journalist died trying to witness, and what emerged from his body is the weapon he was trying to expose. Red Barrels could have given players a triumphant ending. Miles could have escaped, published his story, brought down Murkoff. That would have been satisfying in conventional narrative terms. It would have promised that investigating evil and documenting truth leads to justice. It would have suggested that individual courage can overcome institutional power if you're just brave enough and document thoroughly enough. Outlast rejects that comfort. The game says that sometimes you do everything right and still lose. That witness doesn't guarantee justice. That institutional evil often survives exposure because it has resources and protections that individual investigators can't overcome. That the cost of bearing witness can be the loss of self, psychological, or, in Miles's case, literal. This refusal of narrative comfort is what makes Outlast's ending powerful for people who've tried to expose institutional abuse and watch the institutions survive their exposure. They recognize the reality of fighting power that's insulated by money, legal structures, and social connections. They understand that documentation alone rarely produces accountability. They know that whistleblowers often pay higher costs than the institutions they expose. Miles's fate validates their experience. The witness who does everything right but still gets destroyed by the system they challenged. The ending also suggests that some horror is too powerful to be merely witnessed. The Wall Rider represents trauma and institutional abuse that's achieved autonomous existence. It's no longer contained by the people who created it, or limited by its original purposes. It exists now as an independent force, and proximity to it means being consumed. Miles thought he could document the Wall Rider from safe distance, maintain journalistic objectivity, bear witness without being implicated. The ending says that level of distance is impossible when you're investigating something that warps everything it touches. This might be Outlast's darkest implication, that some institutional evils are so profound that investigating them means risking contamination or consumption, that you can't swim in poison and emerge clean, that bearing witness to systematic atrocity changes you in ways you can't control, and sometimes those changes are severe enough to destroy the person you were. Miles entered Mount Massive as a journalist and left as a weapon. The investigation transformed him into another casualty of the thing he was documenting. For players who've experienced trauma or who've investigated institutional abuse, this ending is devastating but honest. It doesn't promise that confronting evil makes you stronger, or that documenting abuse leads to healing. It acknowledges that sometimes confronting horror just means carrying it afterward. That witness has a cost that isn't always recoverable. That doing the right thing doesn't protect you from consequences. The game's final message is uncomfortable. That individual courage matters but isn't always sufficient. That documentation and witness are essential but don't guarantee justice. That institutions built on abuse often survive exposure because power protects itself more effectively than truth exposes it. That bearing witness is necessary, but the burden of it can destroy the witness. These truths are rarely represented in media, which prefers narratives where good intentions and courage produce positive outcomes. Outlast chooses realism over comfort. The game validates the experience of people who've tried to expose institutional evil and learned how difficult it is to achieve accountability. It acknowledges that whistleblowers often suffer more than the institutions they expose. It refuses to promise that documenting truth protects you from the systems that truth implicates. Miles Upshur did everything a journalist could do. He investigated, documented, witnessed. And the institution he exposed continued operating while he became another casualty. That's not the ending horror games usually provide, but it's the ending that honestly represents how power typically responds to exposure, by surviving and by ensuring that witnesses pay costs institutions avoid. Chapter 7: Why Outlast Endures When Other Horror Games Fade. 10 years after release, Outlast remains culturally relevant in ways most horror games from its era don't. Amnesia, The Dark Descent, which pioneered many mechanics Outlast refined, is remembered fondly but rarely replayed. Slender: The Arrival had a brief cultural moment and vanished. Even successful franchises like Dead Space have fervent fans but limited broader cultural presence. Outlast persists. People who've never played it know about Chris Walker, the battery mechanic, Mount Massive Asylum. The game achieved staying power that transcends its initial release. Understanding why requires examining what Outlast offers that other horror games don't. The game validates powerlessness as a legitimate state rather than a failure condition. Most horror games frame helplessness as temporary, something you experience at the beginning before acquiring tools to fight back. Outlast frames helplessness as permanent. You never become powerful. The game says that surviving without triumph is still survival, that escaping without defeating your threats is still escape, that making it through horror without becoming capable of violence is legitimate. For people who've experienced situations where they couldn't fight back, where survival meant retreat and endurance rather than confrontation, this validation matters profoundly. The asylum setting directly engages with institutional betrayal in ways that resonate with anyone who's been failed by systems claiming to provide care. Mount Massive was supposed to heal people and instead tortured them. That inversion, institutions, that harm under the guise of helping, is experienced by millions of people annually. Medical systems that traumatize patients they claim to treat, psychiatric facilities that damage people seeking mental health care, correctional systems that destroy inmates they're supposed to rehabilitate. Outlast puts you inside a building that embodies that institutional betrayal and forces you to survive its consequences. The variants are simultaneously threats and victims, which creates moral complexity most horror games avoid. You can't feel clean fear toward the things hunting you because the game consistently reminds you they were people who needed help and received experimentation. This complicates the survival horror formula. You're not heroically fighting evil, but desperately evading casualties of institutional abuse. That complication resonates with people who understand that victims can also be threatening, that damaged people can be dangerous, that surviving someone else's trauma responses doesn't mean they're evil. The camera mechanic creates a burden of witness that mirrors real experiences of documentation without justice. Miles records everything and loses himself in the process. This represents the psychological cost of sustained attention to atrocity. The way documenting horror invades your sense of self. For people who've tried to expose institutional abuse, who've gathered evidence of systemic harm, who've borne witness to suffering that documentation alone couldn't stop, Miles's story validates their experience. The game says that sometimes witness isn't enough, but remains necessary anyway. The battery mechanic simulates resource scarcity in ways that trigger recognition in people who've operated without sufficient means, the constant anxiety about running out, the need to search for resources while being hunted, the impossible choices about when to use what you have versus when to preserve it. These create psychological states that people who've experienced poverty, housing insecurity, or institutional confinement recognize immediately. The mechanic is frustrating the way actual scarcity is frustrating, and that authentic simulation creates connection that more forgiving resource systems wouldn't achieve. The ending refuses narrative comfort about accountability and justice. Miles documents everything and gets consumed by what he documented. This honestly represents how often institutional evil survives exposure because individual courage can't overcome organizational power. For people who've tried to hold institutions accountable and watch them continue operating despite documented abuse, this ending validates their experience. The game doesn't promise that doing the right thing produces justice. It acknowledges that sometimes you do everything right and still lose. These elements combine to create something most horror games don't offer: validation for specific types of trauma, an experience that mainstream media typically ignores or simplifies. Outlast says that powerlessness is real, institutional betrayal is real, documentation without justice is real, resource scarcity creates genuine psychological burden, and sometimes surviving just means outlasting without triumph. Every one of these points connects with populations who've experienced versions of these realities and rarely see them represented honestly in media. This creates fierce attachment from fans who needed exactly what Outlast provides. They defend the battery mechanic not despite its frustration, but because the frustration simulates real resource anxiety. They praise the helplessness not because they enjoy feeling weak, but because the game validates experiences where strength wouldn't have mattered. They connect with the variants not because they romanticize mental illness, but because the game shows how institutional abuse creates the conditions for people to become threats. They defend the ending not because they wanted Miles to die, but because his failure to achieve justice, despite doing everything right, represents their own experiences with exposing power and watching it survive. The game also achieved mechanical elegance that many horror games lack. Outlast commits fully to its design philosophy. You are helpless, you will remain helpless, and survival depends on evasion and resource management. This commitment creates coherent experience from beginning to end. Games that give you weapons eventually, or that make enemies defeatable through skill, undermine their own horror by suggesting you can overcome threats through mechanical mastery. Outlast never undermines its core thesis: you're prey throughout, and that consistency creates sustained psychological pressure. that games with escalating power can't maintain. The first-person perspective and camera work create immersion that enhances every other element. You don't watch Miles from detached camera angles. You are Miles, breathing hard, vision shaking, unable to see threats behind you without turning and losing speed. This intimate perspective makes the helplessness personal, the battery anxiety immediate, the institutional betrayal visceral. The game puts you inside its horror rather than letting you observe it, and that immersion makes every mechanical choice more effective. Red Barrels also understood that horror works differently at different paces. Outlast alternates between sustained dread and acute terror. The quiet sections where you're exploring and documenting create mounting tension. The chase sequences release that tension into panic. The hiding sequences force you to hold tension while remaining motionless. This rhythm prevents desensitization. You're not constantly at maximum fear, which would exhaust you emotionally. Instead, the game cycles through different intensities of horror, giving you moments to breathe while ensuring you never feel fully safe. The environmental storytelling rewards attention without requiring it. You can run through Outlast in under 4 hours if you ignore documents and focus solely on survival. But exploring Mount Massive and reading the scattered files reveals layers of backstory that transform the experience from survival horror into institutional critique. This dual approach accommodates different player priorities. Those seeking pure horror can have that, while those interested in narrative depth and psychological complexity can find it through optional engagement. The game's length is also significant. Outlast takes most players between 5 and 7 hours to complete. This is long enough to create sustained immersion, but short enough that replaying feels achievable. Games that require 30 or 40 hours create incredible experiences, but resist replaying because of time investment. Outlast's compact length means players can revisit it, notice details they missed initially, experience the horror again without committing full weeks. This replay value contributes to longevity. People return to Outlast years later and rediscover why it affected them. The game also benefited from launching at a moment when first-person survival horror was experiencing a renaissance. Amnesia had proven the genre's viability. YouTube and Twitch were making horror games culturally visible through reaction content. Indie developers were innovating in horror spaces AAA studios had abandoned. Outlast arrived when audiences were hungry for horror games willing to commit to powerlessness, and when digital distribution made reaching those audiences possible without traditional publishing gatekeepers. The timing allowed the game to find its audience and build cultural presence organically. But timing alone doesn't explain endurance. Many horror games launched in the same era and faded. Outlast persists because it offers something specific that remains rare. Honest representation of experiences that most games ignore. The validation of powerlessness. The acknowledgement of institutional betrayal. The burden of witness. The psychological cost of resource scarcity. These remain underrepresented in games, which means Outlast continues serving a need few other titles address. The devoted fan base that formed around Outlast also contributes to its persistence. These fans are evangelical about the game, introducing it to new players, defending its design choices, creating content that keeps it culturally visible. This happens because the game mattered to them personally. It validated experiences or represented realities they'd never seen acknowledged in interactive media. That personal connection creates passionate advocacy that maintains cultural presence long after marketing campaigns end. Outlast also spawned a franchise, Whistleblower DLC, Outlast 2, Outlast Trials, that kept the core game relevant by association. New releases brought people back to the original, creating cycles of renewed interest. The sequels took different approaches but maintained thematic consistency around institutional abuse and powerlessness. which meant fans of the original often connected with later entries even when gameplay evolved. The game achieved something rare in horror. It found its specific audience and served that audience so thoroughly that it became essential rather than merely good. Most horror games try to appeal broadly, which means diluting elements that might alienate some players. Outlast made choices that alienated players seeking empowerment or mechanical mastery, and those choices made it indispensable for players seeking validation of powerlessness and institutional betrayal. That specificity created devoted attachment that broad appeal rarely achieves. 10 years later, Outlast endures because the experiences it represents remain common and underserved. Institutional abuse continues. Documentation without accountability continues. Resource scarcity continues. Powerlessness continues. As long as those realities persist, Outlast will remain relevant because it's one of the few games honestly representing them. The horror doesn't fade because the realities creating that horror haven't been addressed. The game stands as witness to forms of suffering that games typically ignore, and that witness remains necessary. Conclusion: the horror that validates. Outlast succeeds because it refuses to lie about what survival looks like when you have no power, and the systems meant to protect you have become threats. The game strips away comforting fictions about fighting back, about documentation leading to justice, about institutions eventually facing accountability. What remains is honest. Sometimes you're just trying to outlast horror you can't stop. Sometimes bearing witness consumes the witness. Sometimes institutional evil survives exposure because power protects itself more effectively than truth exposes it. For people who've lived these realities, Outlast is validation. For people who haven't, it's a glimpse into experiences that most media refuses to represent honestly. Either way, the game matters because it commits to truths that remain uncomfortable and necessary. Mount Massive Asylum stands as a monument to institutional betrayal. Miles Upshur represents the cost of witness. The variants embody what happens when systems destroy the people they claim to serve. And the battery mechanic makes you feel the anxiety of never having enough. That's why Outlast hits harder than most horror games. It understands that the deepest horror comes from recognizing that the nightmare is real, ongoing, and rarely punished. The game doesn't promise that confronting evil makes you stronger or that documenting abuse produces justice. It acknowledges that sometimes survival is the only victory available, and even that victory is incomplete.